economists. Joining me now is the first Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog and Professor of Economics at Columbia University, Arvind Panagariya. And later on the show, we'll hear from Executive Director of India at the IMF, Surjit Bhalla. Dr. Arvind Panagariya, really appreciate your time, sir. How do we distinguish between subsidies which are seen as welfarism from freebies? On one hand, the support to education, health, farms are good subsidies, but on the other hand, what is said is that free electricity is really not a subsidy because not every farmer or every household actually needs free electricity.
It's a difficult one, Maria, because, the distortions can come from what is seen as welfarism as well as from what is not seen as welfarism. To some degree, of course, one person's welfarism is another person's freebie. So it is difficult. So economists tend to, think in terms of efficiency effects. Subsidies that have very large distorting effects in terms of efficiency of the economy, those we generally try to discourage. If you wish, you can call them freebies. So clearly, for example, something like a fertilizer subsidy, electricity subsidy when it is given particularly to households that are well-to-do, would both be, in my view, kind of distorting subsidies which don't necessarily serve a social purpose. Distorting subsidies, we can generally, economists are okay when they're serving some sort of welfare redistribution objective. Now, when you think of subsidy, let's say electricity subsidy to all households, it's not quite clearly a kind of redistribution you would want to do. You would rather use the subsidy that is going well-to-do households to the poorer households, even if it happens to be not for electricity.
Yes.
MSP is similarly MSP has also a very similar problem because a lot of it ends up going, really actually the bulk of the subsidy, both on fertilizer and MSP, ends up going to the richer farmers, right? Because who gets the bulk of both fertilizer and MSP subsidy? It's the large landowners,
right.
and therefore these are the well-to-do farmers, not the ones, those who are farming very tiny little farms. In fact, if you think of the small farms, half of our holdings are less than half hectare. They have no surplus to sell on the market, and therefore they get no subsidy on the MSP because they're not even bringing their produce to the APMC or the Mandi.
Okay.
And same, how much fertilizer we use on a half-acre or half-hectare farm. So complicated question, requires a little deeper thinking. But politically, in any case, the subsidies are there.
Yes, you said it rightly. This is in the realm of politics. But of course, economists such as you are weighing in on it as well. Will it be a simplistic view to say that freebies are almost like bribes to win votes? But the other argument then is that those living on the margins of society actually depend on these freebies. They need those freebies and they need that kind of food security or social security.
Yeah, you see, so ultimately, look, in a democracy, it's difficult to eliminate the freebies. I think the debate is very good. I'm glad in that sense that the Chief Justice of India has triggered this debate because that will help us probably at least, on the margins, reduce some of the subsidies that are distortionary and that really don't serve the kind of purpose you have in mind, which transfers to they need them for what there's absolutely no doubt. In fact, they need more than what we currently are able to afford because of the fiscal constraints. And that, of course, makes all the more reason why, subsidies that are discretionary, that are actually going to the well-to-do, should in fact be reduced and therefore diverted to the poor. So that case certainly exists. But when it comes to elections, I think everybody is doing their sense, and we can argue about so these are okay, these are not okay. But in a democratic society, that's something that is there to stay.
All right, Professor Panagariya, today we heard a lot of argument, in fact, happened between the BJP and the Aam Aadmi Party over loan waiver and loan written off. What exactly is the difference between the two?
So the way I understand it is, when we say loan waivers, we are referring to, I suspect, that during elections or prior to elections, parties sort of offering to waive the loans. I think largely those are the loan waivers. That's what we are referring to. I think those are detrimental in a bigger way, which is that you are basically hurting those who are actually paying their loans. So when you waive the loan, those who were actually already paying their loans feel that, goodness, why were we paying them? And so in some degree, you sort of end up punishing those who live within their means. When they borrow, they try to pay them. Whereas those who are delinquents who choose not to pay are the ones who benefit from the waiver. Whereas loan write-offs can have many different forms, and commonly remember that the banks have to write off loans when effectively a business to which they gave the money, to which the credit was given, fails. If that business fails in the end, you have no choice. I mean, that's the risk of lending money. And in every system, every economy, a small part of the loans does go bad, and they have to be then written off. So if that is how the write-off of loans is interpreted, then that's perfectly good expenditure of doing business. I think that's a cost of doing business for the banks or for lenders in general.
Okay.
So if I can make that distinction, then clearly the loan waivers are a far worse thing to do. And in any case, loan write-offs in the way I have described them are absolutely legitimate instrument of policy. I mean, not even policy, but it's just something that, to keep any system of intermediate life alive, you wouldn't.
Okay, Professor Panagariya, another argument is also this, that why punish the poor when crores are in fact waived off by writing off loans of super rich? There is this argument about custom duty, for example. So why not look at the most vulnerable differently from those who belong to the rich category or well-to-do?
No, absolutely. I mean, no argument about that, Maria. I mean, we got to do that. We tend to do that, but one is being driven by the social welfareism, right? I mean, the distributions or whatever expenditures we do on the poor and the vulnerable, those are being driven precisely by the social consensus that the society, as it grows and becomes richer, it has got to take care of these sections of society, and so those transfers expenditures are all very well justified. Whereas these other ones actually get driven by lobbying, by corruption and whatnot. And so they really become a function of the governance, how the government of the day is administering its laws, administering its programs and all. And governments that, want to lobby for accepting corruption and even indulging in corruption, they will create these problems. They would then squander the funds, and the redistribution will happen to the non-deserving. I mean, custom duty, for example, is to me, actually, as an economist, is a good example. doing here? You basically are taking it out of the pocket of the consumer and giving it to the producer, right? Think of automobile. Why should you have to pay? Why should you, that is, as a buyer of an automobile, have to pay 1.5 times the price that I pay for the exactly same automobile here in the United States? Because there is a 100% custom duty on these cars, so therefore it allows the domestic manufacturers to jack up the price, and that to me is a freebie, actually, the producer being given at the expense of the consumer. That's just not justified. How is that justified? There are many of these policy measures that we have introduced along the way. So that, populism in policy, right? Things like Land Acquisition Act. It was just as subsidies are given out of populism or to votes. This legislation was brought in that way that made the cost of the public projects so much higher. Today, even a linear project like road construction, now 3/4 the cost is not building the road, it's to acquire the land. And that has all sorts of perverse effects. The moment people find out the road is going to be built through a particular region, mafias move in to actually buy off that land from the actual owners in advance, so that they can then get the very high price that the Acquisition Act actually requires the government to pay. So, these are unfortunate kind of policies that get adopted.
Okay.
They seem to be popular at the time they are put in place, but ultimately the cost is paid by the taxpayer.
Yes. My last question to you, Professor Panagariya, are you for freebies or not for freebies? And how do you actually look at this link that is there of freebies and welfareism?
Look, the term that one uses, what is a freebie and what is not a freebie. If we are, let's say, talking about any transfer, then of course there are many legitimate transfers, many legitimate transfers. And we have talked about these, the transfers, let's say, to the poor that you do under PM Kisan, or some of the transfers, at least under Food Security Act, selling you the food grain at prices of 1 to 3 rupees per kilogram, depending on which grain it is. And at least to the extent that it is going to the very poor who can't afford 2 meals a day otherwise, perfectly legitimate transfer. But then, a lot of other things slip in, meaning that, we are covering almost 2/3 of the population under the Food Security Act. That's a bit much. Fertilizer subsidy we talked about, there is also a freebie, but it is going largely to the rich. MSP, largely going to the rich. So, freebie definition is simply something that you get without having to pay for it. And a lot of these freebies are very sensible policies. Any democratic government will absolutely have the obligation to actually, give those freebies. But then there are a lot of others which are going to the non-deserving. Those, I think, we should try to minimize.
All right.
By the way, one good example of this is the LPG subsidy. Right, LPG subsidy was going to the well-to-do households, and the Prime Minister actually did try to eliminate that. That was a good example of a freebie being eliminated because it was going to the undeserving. He first started off with the Give It Up campaign. So he tried to do it first by persuasion and then gradually tried to phase it out. So that is a good example of a freebie which was going to the undeserving, having been eliminated.
All right. Professor Panagariya, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much. Let me bring in